So there are these two guys that wanted to make a horror movie in a completely new genre. They spent over 5 years writing it, and then they went into the woods to make it. Then they spent almost a year editing it, and when they were finally done, they took it to Sundance. Everybody loved it, so there was a bidding war, and they sold it for $1 million. And it ended up exceeding their expectations, changing the horror genre forever and spawning a massive franchise. But after that, those two guys took the money and ran, which left everyone else with nothing. But now there's yet another sequel coming out, so the actors banded together and they're suing Lionsgate to finally get their royalties. This is the story of the Blair Witch Project, and I'm going to tell you all about it today on Real Ones. Before I tell you this insane story about the Blair Witch Project, there are two versions of this video. The theatrical cut is right here on YouTube and the director's cut is over on Patreon. It's free to follow, so I highly recommend checking it out, but the reason I need a Patreon for this channel is because of YouTube's insane content ID policy that stops me from making my ultimate vision. I can't use footage, I can't use music, I have to be really careful with the edit. So if you want to see the director's cut of this video, check out the description, check out the pinned comment. I hope you check out the Patreon and follow it because again, it's free. But enough yapping for me, let's get into the video. The Blair Witch Project came out in 1999, but it was a labor of love that started 6 years earlier in 1993. It all started at the Central Florida University when Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez came up with this story about a town that was cursed by a witch who lived out in the woods. While they were in college, they would always hang out and come up with different movie ideas, but no matter what they came up with, they always went back to that original idea. So after they graduated, they got together and they made a production company called Haxan Films, which was less of a traditional production company and more of a creative think tank. And the name Haxan was super fitting because it was pulled from a Swedish horror movie that came out in 1922 that, you guessed it, was all about witches. With their production company all set up, they decided to expand pretty quickly, so they brought on 3 more college buddies named Greg Hale, Mike Manello, and Robin Crowe. So once they had the group together, they spent 6 years writing out a screenplay, and once that was finished, they built out a ton of extensive lore to fuel the entire thing. And while they were still working on the lore, they brought on their friend Ben Rock to help with the production, and he really took things to the next level. He took that backstory they created and then came up with 2 characters who wouldn't be featured prominently in the movie, but they would live in the background and help flesh out the lore to make it believable. The first one of those characters was Ellie Kedward, and she definitely had a very classic witch story where in 1775 in the town of Blair, Maryland, she was accused of witchcraft. The legend they came up with is that a kid in the town of Blair told their parents that Kedward tried to lure the child into her house to draw her blood. The townspeople, of course, took that as sufficient evidence of witchcraft, so they banished her out into the woods next to town in the middle of the winter. Since it was 1775, they obviously assumed she would die to the elements, but come spring, they looked everywhere and could not find her body. Well, I guess her bones, but her body could have frozen. I don't know. They didn't find her body in the spring. And pretty soon after they realized they maybe didn't kill her like they thought they did, a bunch of kids started disappearing from the town. And after that, her legend started to grow and be passed on, and that created the backstory for the legendary Blair Witch. From that point forward, any creepy happening or mysterious disappearance would be blamed on her, and that continued all the way up until the modern day, or the 90s, you know, like when the movie was being made. The plan with that backstory was to use it as the catalyst to get the main characters to go out into the woods to make their own documentary to disprove all the accusations of witchcraft and also help to explain all these creepy stories being natural occurrences. The second background main character that Rock came up with definitely had a lot more visceral of a backstory than Ellie Kedward, and his name was Rustin Parr. Parr was this old hermit who lived in a shack out in the woods, and every night he would see the ghost of an old woman standing at the end of his bed, and she would whisper creepy in his ear. All that yapping understandably got to him, so when she said she would go away if he abducted 7 kids from town, he ran to town and did just that in the year 1940. After he collected all these children, he lined them up in his shack and murdered them one by one, and after that, he walked into town, confessed his crimes, and blamed it all on that creepy old witch. And when he told that story, he called her the Blair Witch, and the name stuck for decades to come. When I read those stories, I was suitably creeped out, but they didn't think it went far enough, so they came up with even more stories about kids disappearing into the woods. In one, an 8-year-old girl disappeared out in the woods, so they sent out a search party of 3 men to look for her, but she came back just fine the next day, and they did not. So they sent even more townspeople out into the woods woods to find them, and what they found was horrific. They were tied up on a rock, they had demonic symbols carved into their flesh, they were disemboweled, and they had their teeth pulled out. And just like with Rust and Parr, the little girl said a ghost of an old woman lured her out into the woods to begin with. And the last story they came up with was that a little girl was pulled into the creek at the edge of town by a ghostly white hand. Who saw this happen? I don't know. And even though this creek was only 1 foot deep, they were never able to find her body. It seemed like she just disappeared into thin air. And in the weeks that followed, the townspeople would find bundles of sticks, bundles of human teeth, and oily substances in the water, and if they drank it, they would get really sick. And again, I feel like those stories are suitably creepy, but as they got closer to filming, they went back and revised them to make them even creepier. For Ellie Kedward's story, it was pretty much kept the same, but instead of just being banished out into the woods, they changed it so that the townspeople dragged her out and tied her to a big rock and a pentagram so that the animals would pick away at her flesh. A couple days later, some kids went out into the woods to see if she was dead, and she was miraculously still alive, so they sent a pack of dogs to tear her apart. And these kids were like truly evil, so they went out a couple days later again, saw she was still alive, and decided to finish her off themselves. So they grabbed some sticks, some knives, and some rocks, and they cut her up, and then they took her blood, put their hands in it, and pressed their hands all over her body. And then the townspeople came out and hung her till she was dead. They also kept in the part about the kids disappearing into the woods, but they added on a bit that caused the townspeople to abandon the town, and then it was rediscovered years later and renamed to Burkittsville. And finally, instead of 3 dudes going out into the woods to find that girl, they increased the number to 5, and they added on a bit where they were all tied up in the shape of a pentagram on a huge rock, which was then renamed Coffin Rock. And if you've seen the movie, which I hope you have if you're watching this, because A, it's amazing, and B, I'm gonna spoil the shit out of it, you'll know that all of this backstory wasn't for nothing. It really provided a lot of the narrative touch points for the big plot structure of the overall movie. Ellie Kedward's extended legend gives the cast members a reason to go out into the woods in the first place, and it also provides a lore reason for the creepy hand imagery and also the stickmen. The Coffin Rock edition gives the characters something to look for out in the woods. Rust and Parr's story gives the movie a 3rd act location for the whole climax to happen in, and the whole edition that the town was abandoned and then rediscovered gives the movie a way to explain why his house was never found until the movie happened. And even though you never hear these legends told in great detail in the actual movie, what the production company did is they told the main cast, who would then recite them from memory, and when they interviewed locals, they did the same thing, and reciting these stories from memory helps them feel like real legends. That delivery system gave the town of Blair, which again at some point renamed itself to Burkittsville to try and shake its negative image, a much more believable feel than you would see in most horror movies at the time, and it built up the faux documentary structure of the finished product. The crew also took the time to compile all of these stories into an 8-minute documentary that they sent into the show Split Screen on the IFC channel. The producers absolutely loved the footage, so they gave Haxan some money for the rights to air it on TV, and that money is what provided Haxan with the budget to start filming the movie. So while you slasher fans out there have definitely heard before that the Blair Witch Project was only made in 8 days, it was only shot in 8 days. It was actually made over a much longer period. It was just that the pre-production period took a lot longer than most movies still do to this day. So even though 100% of the legends and the lore these guys came up with didn't make it into the finished product, what it did do is provide an extremely solid foundation, which is so critical to a found footage movie being successful. And you gotta keep in mind that they didn't even have a traditional screenplay, so it really was important. Anyway, with their budget in hand, the crew started looking for actors. This is one of the most normal parts of production, I would say, because they didn't really buck any trends outside of not working with a union. So not only would not working with a union be cheaper overall, it would also help them break a few rules in terms of filming and safety and everything like that, and it would also help them find a lot more unknown actors, which would really help them sell this as a real documentary and not a theatrical movie, which again was very important. To find their cast, they took out ads in casting magazines and said they were looking specifically for people with good improvisation skills because they weren't using a screenplay with dialogue. Even though they went outside the union, they still got 2,000 entries, so after whittling the list down, the people they ultimately went with were Heather Donahue, Josh Leonard, and Michael C. Williams. They invited the 3 actors to come try out for the roles, and they set up this mock interview where they would ask them weird questions like, you're 10 years into a 20-year sentence and you're up for parole. What do you say to the parole officer? And when they asked Heather, she looked directly into the camera and said, I don't think I should be released, which immediately got her the role. They had the backstory, they had the cast, so it was time to spend 6 weeks building out all all the production materials and mapping out the path the actors would follow out in the Seneca Creek State Park woods. And unlike most horror movies, this was filmed on location in Maryland. This was a very difficult process because they had to plan the route in a way where if the actor got lost and wandered off in the wrong direction, they'd be very easy to find. They also equipped all 3 actors with a high-9 camera and a GPS system, and they gave them each extensive training on how to use both those devices. The cameras were of course for filming the actual movie, and the GPS systems were so they could follow a predetermined path which would lead them to where they're camping for the night, and also some milk crates that were placed along the trail. And I'm telling you, these milk crates were super important to the filming process of the Blair Witch Project because A, they had food and water which would keep your actors alive in the woods, which is like obviously important, and B, they would also have little notes that would tell the actors how they were feeling, what they were supposed to talk about, and everything else that needed to be caught on camera that day. And again, Myrick and Sanchez decided not to go with the union for hiring these actors so they could push the rules a little bit, and what they decided to do to get the best performance was screw with the milk crates. So on the first day, it would have like a sandwich, some water, and a bag of chips. But then on the second day, it would just be a bag of chips and some water. On the third day, it'd be like half a sandwich and less water. And on the fourth day, it would just be a bag of chips. They moved around how much food they were giving the actors. Before you get mad and call the government, I guess, they were given a full dinner every night, but by adjusting the quantity of food and water they got with their lunch, it would make them more irritable and hopefully make their performance better, and maybe even make them lash out at each other because they were so irritable when the script called for it. Another tactic they employed was following the actors through the woods on their predetermined path, but they would stand just far enough away so that the actors wouldn't notice, and then when they went to bed at night in their tents, they'd screw with them. And these tricks were nasty, man. They would play screaming sounds through a boombox, they would play coyote howling noises, they would wait till they fell asleep and scratch on their tents with sticks, and all of this was done for a reason. They wanted the most realistic performances possible, and the script was filmed chronologically, so they would increase the scary stuff as the filming went on. And that's also a massive reason why they had to be so meticulous about the path the actors would follow. The state park was like 6,300 acres or something like that, so if the actor wandered off and got lost while they were sleep and food deprived, that would obviously be very bad. And just to make it extra clear, this torture wasn't just for the fun of it. By the second act of the movie, the characters are at each other's throats, and by depriving them of sleep and food and making them tired and irritable, that provided a very real and raw performance. It wasn't even a performance at a certain point. They were actually at each other's throats. So when the map disappears or the witch moves the woods around them to make them feel lost, all of that comes through in the actual movie because of how the actors felt. My absolute favorite part of the production of this movie is that they shot it during the Halloween season. They started on October 23rd, 1997 and finished 8 nights later on Halloween night, and when it was all said and done, they had like 20 hours of footage. Everything was going fine with the movie up until this point, because post-production is where things started to get messy for Myrick and Sanchez. They wanted the movie to play out in 2 phases. So phase 1 would be made up of the cut down footage of what the actors shot out in the woods, and phase 2 would be made up of documentary style footage that they shot before the actors even went out there in the first place. The phase 2 stuff was mostly nightly news footage, and they also came up with this docu-reality style show called Mystical Occurrences, and they'd splice in parts of fake episodes. And since they had so much raw footage, they decided to have Myrick and Sanchez each cut it down into their own edit, and then they would go with the one that turned out the best. But after 8 months of editing, they ended up with 2 drastically different movies, and what they ended up doing is just scrapping phase 2 entirely and cutting down the 20 hours of phase 1 into one movie. I don't think it needs to be said, but that was the most crucial decision they made throughout the entirety of the editing process, because that's what made it a found footage movie. And if they left in the documentary style stuff they shot in phase 2, I think it wouldn't have made the movie as monumental as it was, like nowhere near that. And this is another slasher fan fact, but while the Blair Witch Project is known as the creator of the found footage genre, there were other found footage movies that came out before it. But just like the situation where Halloween came out after Black Christmas, being the first one to a market doesn't matter. What really matters is catching on with the mainstream. So they ended up cutting that 20 hours of raw footage down to 80 minutes, which is like most of my YouTube shoots, and as Myrick put it, they were scared to release it. But as we all know, in 2024, the movie itself was only half the story when it comes to this movie's success. The other half, of course, was the insane, awesome, genre-defining marketing strategy that they came up with. You gotta remember, this movie was coming out in the 90s, so the internet was was still a relatively new thing. There weren't even a lot of websites out there, let alone places to talk about horror movies. So if you got one of the few horror message boards that were around at the time to start talking about your movie, you could be pretty certain that basically everyone who had a computer and was on that message board would be exposed to your new movie. And that point is where the insanely long pre-production really started to pay dividends for Haxan Films. See, Split Screen didn't just show the footage that one time where they bought the rights, they ended up showing it again in 1998 because they loved it so much, and at the end of the segment they asked their viewers if they thought the footage was real. And on the second run around, Split Screen's message boards were so full of people arguing about this footage that their site would effectively crash. That positive buzz got the producer of Split Screen, John Pearson, to call up Haxan and say, hey guys, I know you have a lot more lore collected, you should make your own website and host all of this lore and production materials there. So they took Pearson's advice and ended up filling the website with video clips allegedly found by students at the University of Maryland, photos released by Frederick County Sheriff's Office, and even Heather's journal, which was recovered from the foundation of Rustin Parr's cabin. And while they were building out that website, Haxan Films had another genius idea to work themselves into the narrative of the movie. So they came up with this backstory that they were a production company who was hired by Heather's mom to compile all this footage that was found out in the woods. And all of this was presented as completely 100% true. They did not let anyone know that this was all marketing for a movie. And realistically, they could have stopped there, but they decided to keep pushing forward to do their best to convince people that this was not a movie and it was a real documentary. They started scrolling through message boards, and when they would see a post where someone seemed to be figuring things out, they'd leave breadcrumbs under anonymous accounts that would then lead these people to even more new footage. The last thing they did was set up an email list to give people progress updates on their footage compilation, and they also set up a merch store that would sell t-shirts with the Stickman on them, and I want one of those t-shirts so bad. And all of this, again, was genius marketing because it fueled this story that they were a scrappy production outlet trying to get by with just pennies, and if you bought a t-shirt, it would help them along in their goal. And it worked. Virtually no one caught on to what they were doing, which is just like so awesome. I love it so much. You cannot do anything like that anymore. The internet is just too big. And that website they made was up for a really long time. You could go and download the original footage that they posted, but unfortunately in 2021, it mysteriously went down, and thankfully it's still on the Internet Archives, but you can't find the actual footage anymore, which sucks. And that brings us up to the release of the movie. So while Haxan was dicking around on the internet, the executive producers took a rough cut of it over to New York City, and they do small secret screenings with that rough cut of the film. And then that executive producer had another genius idea to have theater employees make copies of the movie to then screen for their friends. Harry Knowles from Ain't It Cool News got his hands on one of these copies of the movie, and he told his readers to go check it out at Sundance, where it was officially premiering. The Haxan crew made missing posters for Heather, Josh, and Michael and posted them all over Park City, which made the people who were there to watch movies feel like they couldn't miss that screening. Everything went according to plan. The movie was a huge hit at Sundance, and after the screening, there was a massive bidding war between multiple production companies for the rights to distribute the final product. Artisan Entertainment came out on top, and they purchased the movie for $1.1 million, and they picked up right where Haxan left off with the insane marketing tactics for the film. The first thing they did was leak, in quotes, the trailer to MTV late at night, and then the second thing they did was create this fake documentary called Curse of the Blair Witch, which was an hour long, and they aired that on the Sci-Fi Channel. Of course, they did not let anyone know that this was fake or marketing or anything like that. They did their best to sell everyone on the fact that this was allegedly real footage, and then they went one step further and edited Heather, Michael, and Josh's IMDb pages to say they were missing and presumed dead, so that people, if they found those pages, would actually believe the actors were the real people in the movie. And once the movie came out, it was a massive success, as we all know. It ended up grossing $250 million in theaters. From that point forward, Haxan gave up the act and told everyone that the movie was fake, but because the internet was so small and everything traveled by word of mouth back then, it took a long time for everyone to get the news, so a lot of people who went to see it after it initially came out still left the theater thinking it was real. And this is going to become a common theme on this channel, just get ready for it. Artisan realized they had a budding franchise on their hands, so they immediately greenlit a sequel, which of course was a massive disaster. And when it comes to Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2, there is more than enough info to talk about with that movie where it can make its own video. Even though Artisan had a lot of hits under their belt, like the Blair Witch Project, Reservoir Dogs, and Requiem for a dream. They also had way more bombs. So in 2003, they went bankrupt and sold their IP library to Lionsgate, and this is where things get even worse. If you don't know Lionsgate's whole deal, they're basically like a mid-budget blockbuster factory where they throw a bunch of different trend-chasing ideas at the wall and just hope one of them sticks. They're behind stuff like Saw, the John Wick series, Hellboy, the Divergent series, Ender's Game, the Expendables series. So when they got the Blair Witch Project underneath their umbrella, they knew they had to do something with it. It didn't really come together until 2016 when they tried to make a legacy sequel, and as much as people hate that movie, I actually think it's pretty good. And after that, they worked with Bloober Team to make a mediocre video game, and then they worked with Hunt a Killer to do a themed subscription box, which sponsored my other YouTube channel, and honestly, me and my wife really enjoyed doing it, so I wish they didn't cancel it. As it turns out, that extensive pre-production and first of its kind marketing were so essential to making the Blair Witch successful that they haven't been able to put the lightning back in the bottle. But as it turns out, they're gearing up to do it again with yet another legacy sequel, and if you can believe it, things are about to get even worse when it comes to talking about the Blair Witch Project. On June 12th, 2024, an article went up on Variety titled "The Blair Witch Project Actors Call Out Reprehensible Behavior After Missing Out on Profits for Decades. Don't do what we did." In that article, the original cast reveal the other side of the coin when it comes to the Blair Witch Project's production, and the picture they paint is not pretty.
These were all over newsstands, and we were all three of us were still like working our day jobs. It was bizarre.
See, while Artisan was taking their many victory laps with the movie's success, Heather Donahue was still working her temp job, and she was as close to broke as you can get. And when I say broke, she was at the point where she was still driving her 84 Celica, which broke down on the side of the road one day, and she got out to take a look at things, looked up at the sky, and saw a huge billboard with her face plastered across it, advertising this new hit movie, and she just broke down in tears. Michael C. Williams still had the same job moving furniture that he had before the movie, and he took a temp job as a waiter at an event one day, and he saw his agent. The agent was shocked to see him there, so he asked him why he was a waiter, and Michael just looked at him and said, "You know I haven't made any money." And if you couldn't tell already, Josh didn't get tons of riches from this movie. He didn't make any money either. And when I read that in the article, my jaw hit the floor. I have some friends who have sold movies at film festivals, and from talking to them, I've learned that once you sell your movie, you get the green light for actors to start getting agents and doing interview rounds, and then they also get a payout from selling the movie, and they can start making money from the project. But with the sale of the Blair Witch Project, things really went wrong at the actors' expense. First of all, Artisan wanted to protect that illusion that it was a real documentary, so they stopped the actors from booking any interviews at all until the movie was out. And while that might not seem like the biggest deal considering how important the marketing was for the movie itself, you get paid for those pre-release interviews, and the potential revenue they missed out on was huge because there was so much hype leading up to the Blair Witch Project's release. And the cast went along with this weird arrangement because they assumed that once the movie came out, if it was successful, they'd get a payout based on those profits. And remember, the movie was not a union project, so all those rules that are put in place to protect actors and make sure they get paid fairly, none of those had to be followed by Artisan, and the Blair Witch Project is like the perfect storm of a movie you don't want that to happen on. But Artisan didn't want to take complete advantage of the actors, so when it ended its game-changing theatrical run, they sent them a fruit basket and a check with $0.0 written on it. And with the movie out, at least they could get out there and start doing some paid interviews, right? Well, not really. As it turns out, even though they weren't paying them anything, Artisan felt like they could totally dictate everything the actors could and couldn't say. So like when Heather did an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer and said that she was the poorest famous person in America, Artisan got on the phone and said, "Hey, never say that again." And Heather, Mike, and Josh went along with these demands because they went from feeling like they'd at the very least get some good material for their production reel to being in one of the biggest indie hits of all time, and they didn't want to screw up their relationships with studios on their first movie, which is totally understandable to me. And while I was reading this article, there was this thought that kept growing bigger and bigger in my head, and I'm sure you're thinking it too at this point, and it's of course, where the hell was Haxan during all of this? And I hate to say it, but there's no good part of this story where they come in and save the day, because they made the actors sign this napkin contract before they started shooting that is pretty bad when you read into it. So the first thing that memo they signed said was that if the movie sold for $1 million or more, the actors would get a one-time 1% payment of that $1 million purchase. As I said earlier, the movie sold for $1.1 million, so each actor got a check for $11,000. And when that memo was presented to them, they again just wanted footage for their acting reels at the end of the day. They didn't think this was going to be a multi-million dollar grossing project, so they happily signed this note and moved on with their lives. But it gets even worse, because there was also a line that said by signing the note, they were also signing away their name and likeness rights to Haxan for marketing the movie. And at the time, that made sense to the actors because they were sold on the movie with the idea that their phase 1, would only make up like 10 minutes of the finished product. But remember, during the editing process, Haxan decided to cut out phase 2 entirely and make the entire movie out of phase 1. That call was obviously good for the actors on the one hand because they were in the entire movie, but on the other hand, the movie used their real names for their characters. So when people saw the movie and thought it was real, they attributed the way those characters acted on screen to how they were in real life. And unfortunately for Heather, her character isn't presented to be the most likable person in the entire world, so that baggage followed her for years after the movie came out. And if you're still not completely sold that the actors were mistreated by Artisan, they actually got together and went to Artisan to complain about how little they were paid, and Artisan admitted blame and gave them each a one-time payment. And this isn't going to surprise you, but that payment was like a few $1,000s. It was essentially them saying, here's some money, get out of our office and never come back here again. Now look, I got to acknowledge that actors get screwed over all the time, and it is really difficult to feel bad for them because so many of them come off as entitled or whiny and like they know everything and like they're so much better than all of us normal people. So like I don't really have a lot of sympathy for them most of the time. And I am by no means a union rights activist. I mean, I don't care, go join a union, get your money, but like I've got my own problems to figure out, and there is no YouTubers union that I'm aware of. But this story specifically really pulled at my heartstrings because it's really tough to argue that Heather, Josh, and Mike were not taken advantage of here. Like they filmed the entire movie, they camped out in the woods, they were food deprived, they were sleep deprived, they had to hike miles every day, and when it was all said and done, they were not rewarded anywhere close to fairly for all that literal blood, sweat, and tears that they put into the project. And on top of that, Artisan turned it into a franchise, so they got to use their name and likeness on a bunch of projects in the future and never had to pay them a dime for using their name and face in future projects. So while they were stuck not being able to do interviews or make any money on the project whatsoever, they had to go to the mall and walk by Hot Topic and see a bunch of merch with their faces on it that they were not getting a dime from. And the first final straw for them was when they heard that their faces and names were going to be used in Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2. They ended up suing Artisan, but I don't think it ever made it to court because they settled and they all ended up getting a one-time payment of $300,000. That might seem like a lot of money. I mean, I wouldn't scoff at 300 grand, but when you consider that this movie made $40 million of profit on its $1.1 million purchase cost, 300 grand is nothing. The biggest win that came out of that lawsuit was that they were able to block Artisan from using their name and face in projects going forward, but unfortunately Lionsgate, once they took over, has continually ignored that agreement. Like the 2016 Blair Witch movie centers around Heather's brother, and while they don't show her face in the actual movie, they say her full name, which is breaking the agreement. And then when the movie Tar used the clip of Heather screaming from the end of the Blair Witch Project, Heather told Lionsgate, and Lionsgate was like, oh, thanks. And then they sued Focus Features and didn't give her any of the money they won. And the thing that spurred on this latest lawsuit is the announcement that Blumhouse and Lionsgate are teaming up to bring back the Blair Witch Project once again. And just based on my prior knowledge from seeing all the requels that Blumhouse has made over the past decade, I am nearly positive they're going to have many callbacks to the original movie. And look, I'm not trying to ruin this movie for you. I absolutely love it, and the only reason I'm making this video is because it's one of my favorite movies of all time. I just hate this crappy feeling I get when I think about how three of the most important people to the movie's ultimate success have never really been given the respect they deserve. It's also a huge bummer that they were cut out of the movie's success, because one of my favorite things about its success was that it was a team effort from start to finish. And this is where I'm going to insert even more of my personal opinion. It totally bums me out that Myrick and Sanchez have not come to the actor's defense in seemingly any way at at all. Like, they were asked about this situation for that Variety article, and it's so shitty. They just responded saying, "We don't know anything about that, but get excited for the new movie from Blumhouse and Lionsgate that we're working on for the film's 25th anniversary." And it's very obvious why they're behaving this way. They didn't retain any ownership over the IP when they sold it, but they want to continue reaping the rewards of working on it. So they got to consult on all the sequels, they got to consult on the Blair Witch game in 2019, and they want to continue making money off of it, so they're not going to come out in the actor's defense because they probably won't get more consulting jobs in the future. And it really makes no sense to keep bringing them back after cutting out the original actors because A, I'd argue that all of them are important to the franchise's success, and B, everything that's come out after the first movie has been mediocre at best. Like Blair Witch Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2, whatever it's called, I'm getting flustered here. It's fine. Like, it's built up that community of fans that say, oh, it was always good. It has revival screenings. I went to one at the Alamo Drafthouse in LA and it was awesome, but like, it's not a good movie. And as much as I love Bloober Team, who just knocked it out of the park with Silent Hill 2, that game, it has some cool lore and some cool ideas and the atmosphere is great, but the story is just straight up dog, man. But Jason Blum always advocates for the right people when it comes to making his movies, so I'm just really crossing my fingers that him and now James Wan, since they've joined forces, do the right thing and reach out and work with the original actors, especially if they're going to make a requel like they did with Halloween 2018. But that brings us to the end of this story about how two college buddies came up with a great idea, changed the horror genre forever, walked away with a ton of money, and also left 3 people integral to their success with nothing. If there's any lesson to be learned here, it's that no matter where you are in your career, no matter what your career is, always be your own biggest advocate and learn to stand up for yourself, even if there's a ton of pressure making you feel like you're gonna lose out on a career-changing opportunity. If people want you for a role or a position or something like that, you're on the winning side. So stand up for yourself and be your own biggest advocate. I'm not saying that everyone is out to screw you, but I am saying that most people are out for themselves first and foremost. So while they might pull their weight on a project because they want success from it, it can also come back to bite you in a really big way if you don't advocate for yourself as well. And that applies to everything. I'm a YouTuber now, but I've had a lot of jobs since I graduated college in 2015, and I have never once regretted asking for clarification if something in a contract or a note I'm signing stood out as a little bit iffy to me. Anyway, I really hope things work out in the end because I want to be excited about a new Blair Witch Project. It's again one of my favorite franchises in the entire world, and this is like one of the only situations in history where I'm really feeling in my heart for these actors, and I hope I convinced you two as well because they deserve some props, some money, some recognition, something for the hard work that they put into the Blair Witch Project. Anyway guys, that covers this episode of Real Ones. Please check out my Patreon, please follow it, which is completely free, and maybe take the time to watch the intro video, which is me begging you to just give me some money to keep making these videos because it is a lot of work. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.